Yesterday I preached from Acts chapter 9, 32 to the end of the chapter, and it's about Peter traveling around to these different places, visiting the churches, and he was continuing on with the mission of Jesus. And when he would go different places, there were signs and miracles. In this particular passage, there's two people that get healed, and one of them is somebody who was paralyzed for 8 years. They were bedridden. And then the other one was somebody who actually died. So I guess it's not necessarily a healing, but more of a resurrection to bring them back from the dead. But this is a transition from earlier in the chapter where Paul is basically his whole transformation to go from someone who oversaw murdering Christians to putting them in prison. And then it transitioned to Peter in these two events. And I focused on the situation where he is brought to the upper room of this house where Tabitha had already died. They've cleaned the corpse. They've anointed it. They've got it ready for burial. But somebody had the bright idea that, hey, before we go ahead and bury her, we heard that Peter's in town. Why don't we have him come over? Maybe he can perform a miracle. Both of the instances, he said in the name of Jesus, so it was very clear that the power of the healing was actually the Holy Spirit, not anything that Peter could do on his own. Something you'll notice in the New Testament as they are going around to different towns, preaching the gospel, whether they're in a synagogue or if they're out in public, they change their tone and they change their message. Not the gospel, but they change how their approach. Sometimes it's in defense of the truth that Jesus is the Messiah. Sometimes it's persuasive. Like, for instance, when they go to the Jews, because the Jews know the Old Testament, they will talk about David, and they'll talk about the lineage of David and how the Messiah is going to come from him. And they say, this is all true of Jesus Christ. This is why he's the Messiah. And they'll do that with other issues in the Old Testament to prove to the Jews who know the Old Testament that Jesus really is God. But when they go to the Gentiles or they go somewhere else, they don't have a defensive or apologetic. They have a more persuasive that, hey, the way you're living is not good for you. Here's a different way that God offers. And they try to persuade people that, like, Jesus is better. And what I find interesting about, like, our culture and different age groups, even generations, is the way you deliver the gospel matters. Because it's easy to critique, let's just say, preachers in general. And I'm not saying this that I experience this. I mean, I have, but it's not an ongoing thing. It's easy to critique preachers in the way they deliver something or the focus that they have. But it depends on your context. If you're preaching to an audience who is highly aware of the Christian gospel and they're very hungry for the Christian gospel, then your approach is more encouragement. You're like, keep on with that. Go deeper. But you might be in a context where your congregation or your audience, whoever you're speaking to, and this could be individuals, doesn't have to be a group, are very aware of the Christian gospel, but they're closed off to it. And what that means is they have rejected it. They know about it. They don't want anything to do about it, or they don't want anything to do with it. So at that point, you're not encouraging to continue on, but you're actually then persuading, like, no, like, yes, I know you've heard the gospel, but let me explain to you and try to persuade you why the way of God, why the gospel message is better than culture. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which we are finding is becoming more and more common with the younger age groups. And we see that we actually see that data in surveys that they do in ministries like kids ministries. So when a kid comes into a ministry, they can ask general questions like, hey, have you ever heard of the story of creation? Did you know that God created the world? Have you heard the story of Noah and the ark? And increasingly they're saying, no, we don't know about a God creating all of this creation, or we've never heard of David and Goliath. So they're unaware. They are the other end of the spectrum where they are not aware of the gospel, but they might be hungry for it. They might be closed off to it still. They could be a different religion. They could be a different culture. So when they hear it, they're unaware. If they're open to it, then our message should be at the beginning. Like, let me tell you how all this came to be. Let me tell you, how we actually are made in the image of God and how good that is. And then if for someone who's closed off to the gospel and unaware, again, it's more of a persuasive that, hey, let me show you why Jesus is better. So I say all that because it's easier to critique preachers, but this is applicable on an individual level, depending on who you're talking to. Not that the gospel, timeless message of Jesus changes, but your approach should change. I've even heard it said like, well, nobody knows how to preach anymore, or nobody knows how to share the Bible like they used to. And that might be true, that things may have changed because our audience may have changed. And to be honest with you, it has. There was a time in our country where our audience was one that was aware of the gospel and they were friendly towards it. I don't know if that's exactly where we're at right now. And I do think it depends on your context. Like, you might be in a part of the country. If I was preaching in New York City, I'm sure I would be exposed to a lot more closed off, possibly aware or unaware of Christianity, but there'd be a higher percentage of people who don't want anything to do with religion or God, any of that. But I'm in rural Ohio, so my context is different. I'm preaching to people who probably are aware of a God. They're probably aware of something of the gospel, the Bible. So that's the audience that I'm speaking to. But on an individual level, that could change completely depending on what person I speak to. They could be somebody who's brought up in a home that may have been religious, but they saw maybe hypocrisy, and they're like, I want nothing to do with that. So they heard the gospel, but they're closed off to it. So for you, if you struggle with like, man, I don't know how to talk to people about my faith, maybe that helps. Maybe knowing that, the way I talk about it is going to have to change depending on who I'm talking to. And again, like I said, it's not changing the message, because even in the New Testament, when Paul would speak to Jews and Gentiles differently, because he needed to make the message relatable to them. It would have made no sense for him to go to the Gentile world who did not follow the Old Testament and preach to them the Old Testament and say, this, because they didn't know it. He had to start at the beginning and say, in the beginning, God created everything. So hopefully that helps you come up with maybe some better approaches of how to start conversations. And this is a very broad overview, but also don't be too hard on yourself if you're not sure how to start the conversation. A lot of times you're going to start a conversation with common ground. Maybe it's where you're at. Like, hey, what brings you here? Did you know somebody here? Are you at a party? Are you at a sporting event? Do you have a kid out here on the field? Like, what's going on? That's typically how conversations start. You may not be sitting next to somebody and immediately go into, so what are your views on creation? Do you believe this all came by accident? Do you believe there is a creator who created this? Or do you believe it was created in 6 days? Do you believe it was created in thousands of years or millennial? Um, that stuff all comes probably later. And I want to encourage you to not wait or delegate the responsibility of actually having spiritual conversations with people, though. Like at some point, it's got to get brought up. And you might have to be the one to start that conversation. And I guess I want you to know that I think the most effective way to persuade people, to encourage people to maybe be a little bit more open to the gospel, is by the way you conduct yourself. I think the fruit of the Spirit is very attractive. I don't mean physically attractive. I mean, like, when you interact with somebody and you are kind, you care about them, you're patient with them, you actually give them your focus, they're going to see, man, like, I like that. I like being around that person. So maybe I'm going to be a little bit more open to hearing what they have to say. And maybe if they invite me to a Bible study, or if they invite me to attend church with them, I might be a little bit more open to that. But if you approach it with, hey, you need to do this because I said so, or hey, just come to our church. Like they might not, that like they need to be persuaded. They need to see that there's value in following Jesus. And the value for us, yes, it's eternity in heaven, but that's not all. Like that's not all Jesus came for. Jesus also came so that this life that we live, we would have it to the fullest. And so just thought I would share that with you. I think it's attractive, the fruits of the Spirit, and to make sure that you can adapt your message to who you're speaking to. But all that comes from spending time with Jesus. We need to be with Jesus, become like him, and do as he did. Have a great day.